It was just after midnight on Friday, May 29th, 2026, when the residents of a quiet 10-story apartment block in the eastern Romanian city of Galați heard a sound they were not supposed to hear in their lifetimes. A high-pitched mechanical whine, the kind that has become familiar to anyone living near the Ukrainian border. Then a heavy impact on the roof, followed by an explosion, and then the smell of fire. By the time emergency crews arrived, flames were licking up from the top of the building. 2 people had been injured, and several others were being hurried out of their apartments into the chilly night air. The cause was no mystery. A Russian-made attack drone, part of an overnight barrage of more than 200 aimed at Ukraine, had wandered across the border into NATO airspace and detonated against an apartment block in a country that is not at war. For the first time since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, a Russian weapon had injured human beings on the soil of a NATO member state. That is the kind of line that, once crossed, is very hard to redraw. And the entire continent of Europe woke up to a question it has been quietly avoiding for years. Let's start with the facts of the night itself, because they matter, and because they are still being fully reconstructed. According to Ukraine's Air Force, Russia launched 232 attack drones and 1 ballistic missile against Ukrainian targets in a single overnight assault, part of what has become an almost nightly bombardment of Ukraine's power grid and civilian infrastructure as 2026 grinds on. Ukrainian air defenses shot down 217 of those drones, an extraordinary defensive performance. But 15 got through, with hits recorded in 14 separate regions of Ukraine. One of the drones, whether through navigation failure, electronic warfare interference, or the random physics of mass weapons, drifted off course and crossed into Romanian airspace. Romanian radar tracked it. The drone continued. And then it slammed into the roof of an apartment building in Galați, a city of about 250,000 people sitting along the Danube River near the borders of both Ukraine and Moldova. 2 residents suffered minor injuries from the impact and the subsequent fire. Several more were evacuated. The structure burned for hours before crews could fully bring the flames under control. To understand why Galați specifically keeps showing up in these incidents, you have to understand the geography. The city sits along the Danube, almost directly across the river from the Ukrainian port of Izmail, one of Ukraine's most important alternative export routes for grain since Russia pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal in 2023. That makes Izmail a frequent Russian drone target, and it puts Galați directly in the splatter pattern when those attacks go wrong, or when navigation systems fail, or when Ukrainian electronic countermeasures successfully spoof a drone off its intended course. In a sense, every Russian strike on Izmail and the surrounding port infrastructure is also a low-probability strike on Galați. The drones do not respect borders, and the math of statistics means that if you launch enough of them, often enough, some will eventually end up where they were never aimed. That is exactly what happened on the night of May 29th. Only this time, the random landing point happened to be the roof of a building where people were sleeping. Now, you might be tempted to think this was a freak event, a 1 in a million accident. It is not. Romania has confirmed drone fragments on its territory on multiple occasions since the war began in 2022, including in Galați itself just last month, in April 2026. And the broader pattern across NATO's eastern flank is much more disturbing. Back in September 2025, Romania scrambled F-16 fighter jets when a Russian drone breached its airspace during an attack on Ukraine, an incident in which President Zelensky said the drone penetrated about 10 kilometers into Romanian territory and operated in NATO airspace for roughly 50 minutes. That same month, Poland scrambled aircraft and even closed an airport in the eastern city of Lublin over the threat of incoming drones. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have all reported similar incidents at various points. The pattern is not new. What is new is that the cumulative escalation has finally produced the outcome that NATO planners have been quietly worried about since the war began. Until May 29th, every previous spillover had landed in remote areas, fields, or uninhabited zones. No one had been hurt. The accidents had remained, in a darkly fortunate sense, statistical curiosities. Now 2 people in Galați are in hospital. The lottery has been won by the worst possible ticket holder. Romania's response was immediate, and the language it chose deserves careful attention because it was clearly the product of intense diplomatic deliberation. The Romanian Foreign Ministry called the drone's flight a serious violation of international law and asked NATO for a faster transfer of anti-drone capabilities to its military. That second request is its own kind of confession. It is Romania saying plainly that it does not currently have the tools to defend itself against this category of threat at the scale and frequency it is now occurring, and that it needs help, urgently. General Gheorghe Maxim, the stand-in commander of the Romanian Armed Forces Joint Staff, then held a press conference and chose his words with surgical precision. The strike, he said, was not an attack from Russia against Romania, but, he added, Romanians should understand that Russia is a threat to the security of the countries in the area. Read that statement carefully, because it is one of the most delicate diplomatic balancing acts you will ever see in a single sentence. It is Romania saying that what happened was not technically an act of war. The drone was aimed at Ukraine. It went off course. Russia did not intend to hit a Romanian apartment building. But it is also Romania saying that none of that absolves Russia, that the threat is real, that the pattern is intentional, even if the individual incident was not. The general was working with an extremely thin margin of language between escalation and accommodation, and he found it. NATO's response carried the same careful tone. Secretary General Mark Rutte issued a statement calling Russia's reckless behavior a danger to all NATO members. Estonia's foreign minister condemned the incident. Allied capitals expressed solidarity with Bucharest. But you will notice what nobody said. Nobody invoked Article 4, the treaty mechanism that allows NATO members to formally request consultations when their security is threatened, much less Article 5, the collective defense clause that treats an attack on one member as an attack on all. The reason is straightforward. Article 5 is the most consequential treaty obligation in the modern world. The mechanism that could, in theory, draw 32 countries into open war with Russia. NATO is not going to trigger it over a drone that everyone, including Romania, acknowledges was not aimed at NATO territory. The alliance's strategy, instead, is to keep the response calibrated. Strong words, real military assistance, faster anti-drone capabilities, public solidarity, but no escalation of legal or military posture that could push the situation toward open conflict with Russia. This is the gray zone in action, and Russia is exploiting it with surgical effectiveness. That is, in a sense, the most uncomfortable lesson of the Galați incident. Russia has discovered, perhaps without even fully intending to, that it can repeatedly violate NATO airspace, occasionally hit NATO territory, and even now injure NATO citizens, all without triggering a meaningful collective response, as long as each individual incident can be plausibly framed as a navigation accident or a spillover from a legitimate attack on Ukraine. The deniability is built into the very nature of these weapons. A Shahed-style drone is a crude, flying bomb. It misses its targets all the time. Some of those misses end up across borders. When that happens, Russia can shrug. The drone was aimed at Izmail, not Galați. The drone was aimed at Odessa, not Lublin. Whose fault is it really if the weapons drift? Of course, this defense gets harder to sustain the more often it happens, and the more frequently Russia escalates the raw volume of drones it launches. 232 drones in a single night is not 2022 anymore. It is the new normal of 2026, and the higher the volume, the higher the statistical probability that some of them will end up where they were never meant to go. By increasing the size of its barrages, Russia is, in effect, increasing the frequency of these so-called accidents, even if no individual launch is targeted at NATO. This brings us to the question that NATO planners are now wrestling with in real time. At what point does a pattern become a policy? If Russia continues to launch barrages this large, if drones continue to drift across borders, if more apartment buildings catch fire and more civilians end up in hospitals, when does the cumulative weight of incidents become impossible to dismiss as a string of accidents? And, perhaps more pointedly, when does Russia start to assume that NATO will simply absorb these incidents indefinitely and begin to use that assumption to push the boundaries even further? This is the dilemma at the heart of every modern hybrid war. The aggressor does not need to launch a single intentional attack on NATO territory to slowly degrade the alliance's deterrent power. It just needs to demonstrate over and over that NATO will respond with statements rather than action. Every drone fragment that lands in a Romanian field, every airspace breach that lasts 50 minutes over NATO territory, every fire on a Romanian apartment roof is a small, low-cost test of how much NATO will tolerate. And so far, NATO has tolerated almost everything. There is also a serious operational defense question raised by this incident, and Romania's request for faster anti-drone capabilities points directly at it. The brutal truth is that NATO's eastern flank is currently not well equipped to deal with the specific challenge of low-altitude, slow-flying, propeller-driven attack drones. The air defense systems most NATO members rely on were designed for a Cold War threat profile: jet aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. They are extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily effective against those threats. But asking them to deal with cheap drones that fly low, slow, and in massive numbers is like asking a sniper rifle to swat flies. You can do it, but you will run out of bullets long before you run out of flies, and you will go bankrupt doing it. Romania's plea to NATO is fundamentally about closing that capability gap, about getting cheaper, dedicated counter-drone systems into Romanian hands fast enough to make a difference. The same gap exists in Poland, in the Baltic states, in every country sitting along the eastern edge of the alliance. The drones came for Ukraine first because Ukraine was the war. They are arriving in NATO countries because the war is bleeding outward, drone by drone, and the alliance is not yet equipped for it. The connection to Ukraine's own ongoing struggle is impossible to miss because it is the same struggle, just at a different stage. In the same period as the Galatsi incident, President Zelensky publicly asked President Trump for more American air defense help, specifically Patriot systems, to deal with Russian missile attacks. The Ukrainian Air Force's interception rate of 217 drones out of 232 on this single night is genuinely impressive. But it is also unsustainable without continued Western support. And the global interceptor shortage we have covered before, the one driven in part by the war involving Iran, is making everything harder. Ukraine is, in effect, NATO's outermost air defense ring. Every Russian drone Ukraine shoots down is one that does not drift into Romania, into Poland, into Moldova. Every Patriot that flows to the Middle East rather than Kyiv is one less interceptor available for the next saturation attack. The Galatsi incident is not just a story about Romania. It is a story about what happens when Ukraine's air defense net develops holes, and about who pays the price downstream when it does. And right now, the downstream is increasingly NATO territory. There is also a deeply human dimension to this that should not be lost in the geopolitical analysis. 2 people were injured in Galatsi, and that count is being described as minor, which in news terms it is. But minor injuries are minor only in the statistical sense. The people who lived in that building have now experienced something that no one in their city expected to experience in their lifetimes. They have been bombed, in effect, by Russia. The fact that the bomb was not meant for them, the fact that the war is not officially their war, does not change the experience of waking up to a fire on your roof and being evacuated into the night by emergency services. And for every resident of that 10-story block, the calculation about safety, about whether to stay, about whether to send their children to school the next morning, has shifted in a way that no diplomatic statement can fully repair. The same goes for the residents of Lublin, who had their airport closed last September, the residents of villages near Ismail, who hear air raid warnings on Romanian state broadcasts, the people across NATO's eastern frontier, who are slowly being conditioned to live under the partial shadow of a war that is supposedly happening across an international border. The war has, in small but cumulative ways, already arrived for them. The Galatsi drone just made that fact undeniable. So where does this leave us? The honest answer is that the Galatsi incident is probably not an isolated tragedy. It is more likely a preview. Russia is not going to stop launching massive drone barrages against Ukraine. If anything, the volume is going to keep climbing because cheap drones are one of the few weapons Russia can produce in quantity, and because the strategy of overwhelming Ukrainian defenses is working in the statistical sense, with 15 out of 232 drones getting through to their actual targets on a single night. As the volume grows, the absolute number of stray drones grows with it. The probability that the next one will hit a populated NATO area, that more people will be injured, that someone will eventually be killed, is not zero, and arguably not even small. NATO is going to have to decide whether its current response framework, calibrated language, and accelerated capability transfers is going to remain sufficient. Romania is going to have to decide whether to invest in independent counter-drone capabilities or rely indefinitely on alliance promises. And every citizen of every NATO country along that eastern flank is going to have to live with a quietly elevated risk that did not exist a few years ago. For Russia, the incentive structure points uncomfortably in the wrong direction. As long as the alliance treats these incidents as unfortunate accidents to be managed diplomatically, Moscow has very little reason to change behavior. Indeed, it has reasons to lean in, because the cumulative effect of these incidents is to demonstrate over and over that NATO does not actually have an effective deterrent against gray zone escalation by drone. Every Galatsi is, in a perverse way, an advertisement for the limits of Article 5. Every careful Romanian statement that this is not an attack, but Russia is a threat, is a confirmation to Moscow that the line between attack and threat can be safely walked along almost indefinitely. The terrifying possibility is not that Russia is preparing some dramatic provocation. It is that Russia has already found the equilibrium, that the slow, steady drip of stray drones and minor injuries is exactly the level of escalation Moscow finds most useful, costly enough to corrode NATO unity over time, cheap enough to deny when convenient, and consistent enough to keep the alliance's eastern members in a permanent state of low-grade fear. That is a strategy, not an accident, and it has already, quietly, been working for years. The 2 injured residents of Galatsi will recover. The apartment building will be repaired. The Romanian government will receive its anti-drone equipment, eventually. The press cycle will move on. But the line that was crossed on the night of May 29, 2026, the line between drone fragments in empty fields and drones that injure people in their homes on NATO soil, will not move back. It will sit there, waiting for the next incident to confirm it, and the one after that, until something larger forces the alliance to either accept this as the new normal or to do something about it. If this breakdown helped you see what just happened in Galatsi for what it really is, take the time to follow the broader pattern across NATO's eastern flank, learn how counter-drone defense actually works, and pay attention. Because the next time a fire shows up on a roof in a NATO country, you will already know what it means.